All right, excellent. I think we'll get started there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. It's such a pleasure to have you with me. My name is Aidan Lukes. My pronouns are he, him, and my role is as an Asia Pacific lead at the Migration Youth and Children platform, where we focus on advocating for and awareness raising around the interests and rights of migrants around the world, and in particular in my role in the Asia Pacific region. And on behalf of our organization, I would like to thank you for taking the time to join us and welcome you to this side event entitled Climate Migration and Equity, a call from young people around the Asia Pacific, where we're going to be exploring a bit more around the nexus between climate migration and the disproportionate impacts that the climate crisis and the migration impacts can have on different social groups, as well as different regions across the world. But before we dive any further into today's presentation, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country from the lands which I'm normally located on in Australia. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the Yugambeh language region and extend this respect to all Indigenous people joining today. I pay my respects to their customs, laws, and cultures, and recognize the disproportionate impacts that the climate crisis and climate migration has on Indigenous communities in Australia and across the world. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. To give you a bit more of an overview of what exactly we're going to be exploring in today's session around climate migration and equity, I've divided our session into two parts, really. First, looking at the regional impact and the personal and social impact, and then into young people's concerns and youth-driven solutions for this crisis we're facing. So the first half, these 2 points, we're really going to be focusing on unpacking how climate migration does not affect all of us equally, even though that might be the common assumption that we have, and the way that we need to be able to recognize this in order to create a more equitable future and ensure that no one gets left behind in this climate crisis. In the second half, I'm going to be unpacking a bit more around the consultations that the Migration Youth and Children platform has been running recently and our preliminary findings from our discussions with young people around climate migration and young people's concerns about climate migration and the climate crisis more broadly, as well as what solutions that they've been able to come up with on how we can create a more equitable path forward to ensure that we have a sustainable future that meets the needs of all stakeholders involved. And so what I'm really aiming to do in today's side event is not only be able to inform you more about climate migration and equity nexus, but ensure that we're able to amplify the voices of young people around the Asia Pacific on this issue, because it is ultimately young people who are going to be disproportionately impacted and already have been by this crisis. And if we want to create a more sustainable future for all in this space, we need to ensure that young people's voices are being meaningfully heard in all discussions about how to create a future. But before I dive more into my part of today's session, I'd love to start with a bit about what everyone else thinks. If you can go online to menti.com, if you haven't used Menti before, it's just a very simple quiz tool to use. So if you follow on to the link www.menti.com and type in the code at the top there, 15863177, I have a brief little quiz that I'd love for you to answer around what comes to mind when we hear the phrases climate migration and equity. And I want you to add in as much as you can think of. That could be a few phrases, that could be a few sentences, whatever comes to mind when you think of these two topics. So if everyone can head on their phone or laptop to Menti now and type in that code again, that would be fantastic. And we'll start putting the results up on the screen. All right, fantastic. So we have some really great options coming through right now. So we have things around relocation and vulnerability. So exploring potentially the people who are already more vulnerable to this crisis than others. That's fantastic. Climate refugees and climate justice, absolutely. So looking more into who is going to be affected by this crisis who will have to relocate due to this crisis. Seasonal workers, that's another really interesting point, I think, and we can discuss a bit more even around how seasonal workers can often be exploited in the new areas that they relocate to when they've already faced a crisis in their homelands. These are really fascinating words coming through. Thank you so much for your participation, everyone. Keep them coming if you have any more. Excellent. We can see as well income inequality. That's an absolutely critical point in this discussion around how the effects of migration and how that can have really significant impacts for people's ability to earn an income, and that not only has immediate impacts, but in the long term for being able to have a sustainable future for themselves, for their families. Widening inequalities, absolutely. Looking at how not only is there a disproportionate impact, but if we don't address that, that can create even bigger gaps in our societies. Youth mental health too, absolutely, and how not only does climate migration have physical impacts, but there are mental consequences too. These are really amazing thoughts, everyone. Thank you so much for adding those. And I think these are really all the points that we're going to be diving deeper into right now around the climate migration and equity nexus. So that's really good to see we're already all on the same page, I think. Excellent. So what I'd like to start now with is around the inequity in regional impact that I discussed before briefly. So when we discuss inequity and regional impact, what we're really exploring is the way that countries and regions which are contributing most to the climate crisis, and by consequent climate migration, are often not those who are most impacted by climate migration itself. And they're not often at the forefront and facing the key challenges that other nations are. So if we look, for example, at this graph here provided by Carbon Brief in 2021, we can see that the countries with the largest cumulative emissions are displayed in the graph. So it's countries like the United States, China, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Germany. And if we examine more closely then who in these countries is from the Asia-Pacific region, we can also see that we have some key players, being China, Indonesia, India, Japan, Australia, and Iran. Now, what I want you to think about is, are these countries who are contributing in one respect to the greatest amount to this crisis really being the ones most affected and at the forefront of the change being experienced, having to leave their homelands as a result of climate change, having to be forcibly displaced, and having to experience the trauma involved in having to find a new community in a completely new region? Well, the answer is often it's not, because estimations by the World Bank Group suggest that by 2050, 88.9 million people could be internally displaced within the Asia-Pacific region. 88.9 million people in a worst-case scenario. And that is an enormous amount of people who will have to be leaving their homelands and having to find new regions to reside in. But where these 88.9 million people largely reside is not in these countries that are contributing most to climate change. Rather, it is in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, China, and Bangladesh, who are all going to be at the forefront of this crisis. In addition to that, further analysis suggests that island nations such as Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Fiji will also be experiencing disproportionate impacts in terms of relocation due to climate change. And so what I really want to highlight to you here is that there is this clear disconnect between those contributing most to climate change and to the climate crisis we find ourselves in, and to those who are most affected by climate migration. And this is a really critical regional inequity we see in this space. So just again, to reiterate here, these are the countries that are contributing most, but they're seldom facing the most severe consequences. And so when we talk about equity in terms of climate migration, it's critical that we're able to think about it in these terms of who is being affected and who is contributing, and how can we better address this issue, and how can we ensure that we create a path forward there where there's a more even distribution of people helping in respect to the contribution that they've created. So now that we've talked about it in terms of inequity and regional impact from climate migration, we can also use a different lens to examine it in terms of personal and social impact. So not only is there a discrepancy in terms of who is contributing and who is experiencing it by region, but there is also an inequity in terms of which social and societal groups are being most hard hit. Because while we often assume that climate change and climate migration affects all of us, and to some extent this is very true, certain groups in our societies are much more affected than others by climate change and climate migration. And if we want to be able to ensure that no one gets left behind and continue to advance agendas focused on equity and a more sustainable and inclusive future for all, we cannot undermine the ramifications that these inequities across personal and social groups have. So to give you a few examples, this list is by no means exhaustive, as we know that there are a broad range of other groups as well that are affected by climate migration and its disproportionate impacts. Some of these groups include women and gender diverse people, people of color, Indigenous people, persons with disability, people residing in regional and remote communities, and LGBTQIA+ people. So all of these different community groups, while everyone is feeling the impacts of climate change and climate migration, it's particularly hard-hitting for people who identify with one of these groups or others, such as persons experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. So what I want to do now is dive a bit deeper into one of these groups in particular. And I want us to explore more about the inequities experienced by women and gender diverse people who are facing the challenges presented by climate change and climate migration. Now, if we are diving deeper into this issue, we can really see that it does unfold as a gendered crisis. And we can really analyze this through the lens of before climate migration occurs, during the process of climate migration, and after climate migration. Now, research by the International Organization for Migration suggests that before migration occurs due to climate change and the subsequent forcible displacement, that there are actually societal barriers that exist for women and gender diverse people to even be able to relocate. So we often assume that when facing such a significant challenge in one's hometown, in one's regional community, that there will be an opportunity to relocate. But outdated gender norms can often mean that women are left behind. And there's an expectation for women to stay in their communities to care for the land or to care for community members, while men are able to relocate to new areas to pursue new opportunities and safety. So before we even are able to explore what happens during the climate migration process, we need to recognize that sometimes women do not even have the opportunity to move in response to such an issue. And that is really a critical barrier in the first place if we want to ensure a more equitable future for all. Now, during the process of climate migration, if a woman or gender diverse person has been able to undertake this process in response to climate change, they face a myriad of risks and challenges during the migration process. Now, the first is around violence and abuse, because while you might assume that these sorts of issues around violence, abuse, the climate crisis occur in isolation, they don't. Unfortunately, the issues that we face around the world and including in the Asia-Pacific region around gender-based violence and domestic abuse do not finish during a climate crisis. They continue to pervade all aspects of our society. And so during the migration process, women can be subject to violence and abuse, and similarly gender diverse people. And this again illustrates one of those disproportionate impacts that men are often not facing when undertaking climate migration. Similarly, as mentioned before, the discrimination that women and gender diverse people face due to systemic issues in our society do not end during a climate crisis and do not end during climate migration. And this continues to further the stress and burden placed upon women and gender diverse people during the climate migration process, because there is discrimination in all aspects of our society. And that does not end when having to migrate. Women and gender diverse people are also at a much higher risk of being engaged in human trafficking and being subject to the trauma that this brings. And this is, again, something that we are needing to address in the years to come, and as soon as possible, really, because with climate migration occurring, risks of human trafficking are only going to increase. and with women and gender diverse people really at the highest risk of being subject to that practice, that is a critical risk and a critical inequity that we can identify. Finally, one of the other risks during the migration process is around the physical and mental health risks, and particularly in relation to women's sanitation and gender diverse people's sanitation, as well as their reproductive health, that we know is in so many ways severely threatened and limited across the world and in the Asia Pacific region. And again, this is only amplified during a climate migration crisis when there are a myriad of other insecurities being faced during this time. So we can now see that there are clear discrepancies in the experiences of women and gender diverse people against men, for example, when experiencing climate migration beforehand, during the process. And if we now examine after climate migration has occurred and someone has resettled in a new location, we know that women and gender diverse people face a lack of access to opportunities in their communities. And again, this does tie back to many of the systemic issues we already identify in our societies in terms of women and gender diverse people's access to employment opportunities and to support networks in their communities that are so often afforded easily to men, but not to women and gender diverse people. And this again amplifies the physical and mental health risks and the trauma from the climate migration process, because we find women and gender diverse people in a completely new community without support networks and without an ability to work with their community to create a sustainable future in their new home. And so this is really one of the key ways we need to focus on addressing these issues in this gendered crisis that we find ourselves in. And of course, something that's important to remember is that these are just some of the gendered impacts. And these gendered impacts do not occur in isolation. They occur throughout all stages of this climate crisis and climate migration. And they're going to continue to occur until we're able to analyze this issue with a gendered lens and ensure that we're able to create policy which is addressing these key challenges. Now, I don't have time to dive into all of the disproportionate impacts for each of the communities I've touched on today, but on the screen, you can see just a few examples of potential impacts that other communities could face. For example, with Indigenous people, this includes cultural loss and discrimination. For persons with disability, it includes inadequate tailored support, discrimination, and housing insecurity, where the housing provided isn't able to meet the needs that their disability requires. For regional communities, it involves being located in disaster-prone areas and inadequate regional support, particularly with political power, often delegating more power to big cities and urban areas where the votes often can lie. And for LGBTQIA+ people, around similarly discrimination, violence and abuse, and physical and mental health, which is not tailored to their unique needs. Again, as I mentioned before in my previous slide, these are just some of the disproportionate impacts we can see, and these are not confined to these community groups only. And this really brings me to my next point, which is around the importance of an intersectional lens when we are analyzing the climate migration crisis we're facing, and we're looking at ways that we can move forward to create a more equitable future for everyone involved in this space. We need to recognize that often people do not identify with just one of these groups. We can have a woman who is a person of color, who may also be Indigenous and identify with the LGBTQIA+ community. We may have a person with a disability who is also a young person and lives in a regional or remote community. And when we have more of these different identities and community groups intersecting, what we need to recognize is that the disadvantage and marginalization experienced in the climate migration process is only amplified, and it only continues to occur at even more so of an extent. And if we want to be able to move forward productively in this space, then we need to bring an intersectional lens to the table and to recognize the compounding disadvantage that can be faced and ensure that policy that is being developed takes this into consideration to ensure that no one is left behind, no matter what communities they identify with. Now, the final point I would like to bring you to when we're talking around the sort of social and personal groups and the inequity in climate migration that we see is really a paradox that I see. And the paradox is, for so many regions and countries within the Asia Pacific, we need to ask ourselves, how can we claim to advance societal equity when we continue to impose such disproportionate impacts? Now, what do I mean by this? Well, what I mean, for example, is in Australia, we have an Indigenous advancement strategy that is focused on empowering and advancing the rights and needs of Indigenous people across the country. In New Zealand, we see a strategy for persons with disability. And similarly, in Japan, we see an act for preventing discrimination against persons with disability. In India and China, we also see policy around advancing women's rights into the years to come to ensure their empowerment and their equal access to opportunity. But the question that I'm left asking is, how can we claim to be advancing equity agendas, whether that be in terms of Indigenous reconciliation, whether that be in terms of LGBTQIA+ equality or gender equality, when we continue to impose forced displacement from homelands on these different community groups? And these community groups continue to experience this at such a disproportionate rate. I think this brings us to a really key issue that has to be addressed moving forward. If we're talking about equity and equality in national policy, we need to ensure that we're considering the climate crisis and climate migration in particular. Because until we do that, we cannot truly say that we're advancing these equity agendas when we continue to have people facing such significant challenges in their ability to find a safe land to live in. Now I'd like to take your attention to young people and young people's concerns on equity and climate migration. And so, as I mentioned before, the way that we've developed these perspectives is by having consultations with young people in the Asia-Pacific region around their views and perspectives on climate migration and the climate crisis more broadly, and what they see to be the key issues that are not being addressed but need to be addressed in order to create a more equitable future in this space. The reason that the Migration, Youth and Children platform sees this as being such an important thing to do is that we know that young people have been excluded from this discussion, despite the colossal impacts this crisis will have on their livelihoods right now and in the years to come. We know that from a myriad of different climate conferences, of climate advocacy events, that so often young people are making their voices heard, but it is rarely listened to. And if it is listened to, it's rarely implemented into concrete policy that takes their perspectives into account. And at the Migration, Youth and Children platform, we want to change that. And we see an opportunity to ensure that young people's voices are heard. And we're going to continue to advocate for that until we see actionable change occurring. And that's really what brought us to the idea of conducting these consultations. So to talk to a few of our preliminary findings, one of the biggest things we found is there is this contribution effect imbalance that young people recognize. Young people in the Asia-Pacific region see that some of the biggest contributors to the climate crisis, whether that be Australia, whether that be India, China, or New Zealand, for example, and just to take a few examples, are very rarely the ones facing the brunt of climate migration and this crisis that we find ourselves in. And it is so often other nations, as I talked to before, such as Vietnam or Kiribati, who are facing the most severe consequences and are at the forefront of this issue. And young people are concerned about this, and young people recognize that there needs to be a change in this space, but see that this has not yet happened, because there continues to be this contribution to climate change and a failure to look towards a more positive future in the climate space, while these other nations continue to face severe consequences. And so that is really what young people recognize, and they need to see change in this space. Another key finding that we have found from discussions with young people is ultimately the key issue that climate migration stems from. Climate migration is ultimately a result of the climate crisis we find ourselves in, which we find ourselves in due to climate inaction from governments across the world. Young people are incredibly concerned that despite decades of advocacy, we still often find ourselves in the same place, with very minimal or non-ambitious changes being made to climate policy across the world and in the Asia-Pacific region. And young people are saying to us that until we're able to address this key cause of climate migration, none of our policy changes are going to be sustainable. And I think a really salient takeaway for me was in one of our discussions where someone representing young people in their community said, you know, we cannot continue to just assume that we can move people around to different areas. At the end of the day, this climate crisis is going to affect all of us. It is just a decision. It is rather a matter of when it affects all of us. And so we need to ensure that we're making sustainable climate action that is ambitious and future focused now to ensure that we're able to best prevent the continued destructive impacts of the climate crisis and climate migration. So that's really the second key finding that we were able to take away from our discussions with young people, was around climate inaction and the frustration they feel that there is still a continued lack of action in this space. Some of the other key findings that we were able to take away was first around the physical and mental health impacts of climate migration for young people. And really, young people want it to be known that not only does climate migration involve having to leave your homeland and having to face new challenges in a new region, but that can manifest in many mental health challenges, whether that be anxiety or depression, for example. And not only does that anxiety or depression manifest mentally, but it can also manifest physically. And it can lead to severe stress in a physical form for many young climate migrants around the region. And this is something that young people recognize and want to see change in this space. In addition, young people also are concerned about the inappropriate social dialogues in migration as a whole, but particularly in relation to climate migration. Young people recognize that so often we have dialogues that are not constructive in our home countries, and those that villainize migrants and do not welcome them into the new country. And young people have said to us that this is not productive, and this does not recognize the immense trauma and the immense distress that migrants are under when they come to a new region. But not only this, but also the immense benefits and the immense joy that migrants can bring to their new communities, and the way that they have so much to contribute and bring to the new communities they integrate into. And that this vilification of their identities and vilification of their experiences is incredibly unproductive and is in no way going to create a better and more equitable future. So this is really the second key other finding that we were able to take away. And the final one was around the lack of support systems for climate migrants. Now, this extends across all aspects of the migration process, but particularly after migration has occurred. We see that language training is often not provided if there is a language barrier. There can be a lack of cultural support to better understand the new community in which migrants are integrating. There's a lack for particularly women and gender diverse people or people with families or children. There's a lack of support to enable them to be able to thrive in their new environment. And so this lack of support systems is really another key issue that young people have identified in this space and want to see change in. They want to see key support systems implemented to ensure that while the migration process can never be seamless, that it is able to be occurring in the most supportive way possible, and that no one is left behind in this process and left to feel as if they're fighting for themselves with no one to help. Now that we've explored a bit about what these young people have been saying to us in our consultations, I want to draw your attention to how young people see the way forward. Because young people don't only have concerns in these areas, but they have some brilliant ideas on how we can create a better future in this space. And that's what I really want to amplify in today's discussion. Some of these ideas about what we can look for in our national and international policies to ensure that climate migrants are best cared for and best protected. So in terms of youth perspectives on a path forward, one of the first key takeaways that we've had is the importance of amplifying the voices of those who are most effective, but least heard in these discussions. As I've talked to before, we see so often that in international debates, we have people making policy who are very often not the ones experiencing the greatest challenges. And so young people have said to us that we need to ensure we're giving the microphone to those communities that are most affected. And we're saying to those communities, we want to hear your perspective, and we're going to turn it into actionable change. And some of the ways that young people see this potentially manifesting is through change agent programs, as an example. So being able to go in with consent to these communities and being able to work with them to create advocacy networks and to create pathways to ensure their voices are heard, and that there is the ability for autonomy in this process, and there is an ability for it to be youth-led and community-led. In addition to this, it's been suggested by young people that there need to be consciousness raising activities within these communities that would be also incredibly productive for achieving this path forward. Additional perspective that we've seen is around a proportionate and equitable response. So as I've talked to today, we know that the current responses are in no way proportionate and equitable. While we see various countries within the Asia Pacific contributing disproportionately to the climate crisis and to the issues we are currently facing, we know that they are not taking their fair share of the burden in being able to assist in the climate crisis, nor being able to assist specifically in relation to climate migration. And what young people see through this discrepancy is a need for there to be a path forward that sees some sort of equitable response and some way that we're able to apportion liability for the current situation in which we find ourselves. Now, one way that this has been suggested is through legal obligations, whether this be implemented on a national or international scale, for those which have contributed most to this issue, whether that be on a countrywide scale, whether that be specific corporations, having to pay for the issues that have been created. And in some way, whether that be financial compensation or otherwise, being able to assist in creating a more sustainable path forward. Because young people do not see it, to be fair, that such harm has been imposed on communities, yet nothing has been done by the people who have imposed harm in order to solve the issues. And on a similar note, young people have suggested reparations, again, whether that be financial or otherwise, to ensure that those who are responsible for this crisis are paying for what they have done, and ensure that those who are being most affected are able to receive enough support and adequate support in this crisis. One of the final perspectives that we've seen from young people is the importance of legal framework reform in this space to ensure protection for new climate migrants. So we often, in our discussions, were able to hear from young people who would suggest that there was inadequate protection on an international scale in terms of international conventions, as well as in terms of domestic immigration policy on how we can protect people who are specifically displaced in relation to climate-related causes. And that in many, many regions, this sort of protection does not currently exist, yet it is of the utmost importance that it does. And so young people see that one of the critical pathways forward is around creating national and international ways for this to be done, and exploring things such as reform, for example, to the Geneva Convention, as well as reform to domestic policy to ensure protection for climate migrants. So these are just three of the ways that young people have suggested we could potentially move forward, and some of the key themes that we've been able to identify through our discussions with young people on this topic. But one of the really critical themes that we were able to draw out beyond the specific type of policy response is ultimately the importance of policy reform grounded in intersectionality. And this is something that we see at the Migration, Youth and Children platform as incredibly important, but we've also heard from young people in the region to be incredibly important for our more equitable future. Now, the reason we see policy reform grounded in intersectionality as critical is because we need to firstly ensure we recognize and account for disproportionate impacts. And that is not seeing these community groups who are most affected or regions who are most affected in isolation, but it is seeing them as their full selves and seeing them as a combination of all their identities and the way which all their identities and experiences may have impacted their experiences that they have faced. But it is not only this, it's not only so we can recognize and account for these disproportionate impacts, but it is ultimately to ensure that no one is left behind in this process and that we avoid furthering existing inequities experienced by these groups. We know that the groups that I've talked to before, such as women and gender diverse people, people experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness, individuals who identify as LGBTQI+ or Indigenous, for example, these are some of the groups which experience the greatest inequities in our existing societal structures. And if we are not to take an intersectional approach to policy reform, we fear that we're going to further these inequities. And we are going to have people who are left behind in these debates and in the path forward that we craft. So by ensuring that we are able to take a gendered lens, for example, we're able to see climate migration through the lens of an Indigenous person, that we're able to take this perspective and an intersectional perspective will ensure that we create a better future for all, regardless of how someone identifies, regardless of someone's experiences, and that ultimately the path forward is one that's better for everyone, not just some of us. And so I think really, when we've now reached this point where we understand what young people are looking for and how young people see future-driven solutions that are really co-created with young people playing out, it's on the onus of governments now to take action. Because unfortunately, we know that young people are so often excluded from these debates, and young people are excluded from positions of decision-making power. But it is, again, young people who are going to be disproportionately impacted by this crisis. And so in relation to this, I would really like to take this opportunity to make a call to action. And I would like to say that we call on governments around the world to work meaningfully with young people in this space, and migrants and climate migrants in particular, to co-design a better future. Because ultimately, young people have been saying for decades what their perspectives, their ideas, their solutions are on these topics. But nothing can be done until young people are put into positions of power and space is made at the table for young people. And not only certain young people, but young people from all different backgrounds and all different identities. And in this situation, migrants and climate migrants in particular is of the utmost importance. Nothing can be done actionably until we have those young people at the table and until we have leaders in power who are listening to the voices of young people and who are saying that we recognize the impacts that this is going to have on your lives, on your livelihoods, and that of your children and their children. And we're going to listen to what you have to say, and we're going to put that into clear policy reform that is concrete and is meeting your needs and the needs of the generations to come. So what we are really calling on then is for governments to take actionable change and to take meaningful change that will see a better future for all. That brings me today to the end of my remarks on the topic of climate migration and equity. And I'd really like to thank you for your attention over the past 40 minutes on this topic. It's been such a pleasure to share it with you all. I'd now like to invite any questions, thoughts, or comments on this topic from the floor, whether that be, you can certainly turn on your Zoom camera, your microphone and share, or if you'd like to type that in the chat as well. Anything that you've reflected on through this discussion, anything that you want to know more about, anything that you think needs to be amplified in this space, I would really love to hear your perspective.
Hi, this is Aishwarya Kandasamy from India. So I have posted this question in my chat, but I also thought, why not turn on my mic? So greetings. The question is, most nations have constitutions or legislations which, have equal rights and equality, as an inherent part of them, right? So technically, be it the persons with disabilities or trans, or theoretically provided equal rights in law. But we know very well that there is this bridge between the theory and what happens practically. So how do we bridge this gap between the theoretical equality and practical discrimination? And also when you say policies, that keep the rights of underprivileged or, minorities in the center of it, especially in the context of climate crisis, how exactly will that policy be? Yeah.
Absolutely. Those are two excellent questions. So thank you very, very much for bringing them to the table. I think they're really important issues. Oh, we have the same question as well. So I think I'll start with your second question first. So around what is it kind of that we see with those policies playing out? I think that is really, I think it can take a lot of different sort of approaches in how that actual policy looks like. But I think at the end of the day, what we are really looking for and what we've heard from young people is that we can often create a lot of different sort of policy documents, policy briefings, policy papers, all about, this is how we're going to better address the rights and needs of this particular group in relation to climate migration. But it often just stays in this sort of conceptual stage of, this is a policy, this is a brief that we've come up with, and it doesn't actually lead into actionable change. So I think that in terms of what the policy can look like, that really brings us back to the importance of amplifying the voices of all these different community groups and being able to speak to them and ask them what it is that they need in this situation. So I can't speak for those community groups in particular, but I would say that by being able to really focus on having governmental structures that amplify those voices and take them from a consultation, such as we've been doing, to taking them back to the sort of people who are in the positions of power and saying, let's look at how we can better design these opportunities, and having clear guidelines and actionable items on how we're going to move forward on creating these opportunities. That's really going to be the best way forward. Because I think until we actually speak to these community groups on a national and international level and have a continued amplification of their voices, we're never going to be able to create policy that actually works. We're only going to be able to create policy that we think works and that we think is addressing the key issues. But until we have those hard conversations and honest and authentic conversations and turn that into actionable change, I don't think we can really suggest that the policy is going to be most effective. So that's what I would say in terms of your second question is really, I don't have all the answers for what the policy looks like specifically, but I think that by having the conversations with the most affected community groups, that's where we can find what it is that they need from us and how we can create that better future. In relation to your first question, so how do we bridge the gap between theoretical equality and practical discrimination? I think that's such a fascinating question to ask because, as you've mentioned in your question, we really see that at a national level and even international level with international human rights conventions, that there is inherently a protection for all these different groups who experience marginalization in the community, but that's often not what goes into practice and what we actually see at the end of the day. And the way that I really think that we, like in my own opinion, the way I see us being able to bridge the gap between that theoretical equality and the practical discrimination that we see is by being able to recognize first that this discrepancy exists. So I think until we kind of recognize that there is this discrepancy, we're not going to be able to move forward because we have this idea that, you know, we have this act on protecting the rights of women, or we have this international convention on the rights of the child. And while we certainly do, we need to recognize that the discrepancy exists in actual implementation of those acts and conventions. And then in terms of being able to practically solve the problem, I think again, for me, it really comes back to being able to speak with the affected community groups and say, tell me about your experiences of discrimination. Tell me about your experiences and challenges and marginalization. And what do you wish had been done differently? Because I think, again, we have policymakers at the sort of upper echelons of our government who think they're creating the best policy for these community groups and think that it's working effectively. But we know that's not the case. And we're only going to be able to meet the needs most effectively of those affected by speaking to them and having these sort of authentic discussions. So I think that really is what it comes back to for me, is amplifying the voices of affected community groups in order to be able to bridge that equality and practical discrimination gap. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Super
yes, it is. Yeah, thank you very much for your answer too. So the first solution that we need to focus, if I'm not wrong, would be an inclusive representative democracy.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Excellent. That's a wonderful question and very, very thought-provoking. So thank you very much for that one. Does anyone else have any other comments, even questions, thoughts, anything else that they've taken away from today's side event that they might like to reflect on or share with everyone before we finish off today?
I had a question. Like, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation today. And this is actually like one of the topics I'm researching currently, so it was really insightful. But I was wondering about like what role better developed countries such as China and South Korea, for example, can play in like mitigating the issue of climate change in vulnerable countries, or like help migrants adapt to changing climates.
Yes, absolutely. That's a fascinating research area, just to say on the first instance. But I think, again, that's such an important question around how can countries with more economic resources or otherwise be able to support those who have less economic resources and who are really bearing the brunt of this crisis? I think from my perspective, the way I see that playing out is really through, firstly, more ambitious climate action. So as I talked to before, we have a lot of these more economically developed countries suggesting that they're making great progress on climate change and we're taking climate action, but we know that it's not ambitious enough. And I think we saw last year at COP26 really that the sort of ambitious plans that people had been putting forward to create a better future were being struck down by more economically developed countries and weren't being signed off and were being watered down by those countries. So I think the first thing we really need is we need more economically developed countries, those with more economic resources, to have a really honest and authentic understanding that it's not good enough anymore to just be sort of making minor changes in your climate policy. The time to make ambitious action was many, many years ago, but the second best time is right now. And until we have that ambitious change happening, there's no way we can really suggest that we're helping these other countries, even if we are contributing financial resources, for example. Until we've actually addressed the root cause of the problem, we can't really suggest that there's meaningful change occurring. I think the second point beyond the sort of climate action space would be around the legal obligations and reparations, because we know that these larger countries have been the ones that have contributed the most to this crisis. And we know that they have known about the impacts that it's had on other regions, but have so often not taken action on that. And so I think from our discussions with young people, one of the really key takeaways is that we need some form of legal obligations, most likely on an international scale, to say that you have an obligation to assist these countries given the harm that has been imposed. And what that actually looks like in practice, I think, is something that needs to definitely be explored more. But there needs to be some sort of obligation, because we know that otherwise these countries have their own interests at heart in many situations. And until we have an obligation that's legally binding or in some other way binding to say that you need to make actionable change and you need to devote significant economic resources or significant resources otherwise to assist your neighbors, then again, I don't think we can really suggest that we're being able to meaningfully help, because one-off donations and things like that are certainly helpful, but it's not constructive in the long term. And the last thing I would say as well is, I think often we see larger and more economically developed countries suggesting that, you know, this is an issue that isn't necessarily relevant to them. And we see so often that, whether that be directly said or indirectly done through policy action that's not ambitious on climate, that there's an assumption that it's not going to affect us. And it really takes me back to one of those key insights I had from someone in our discussions, which was, at the end of the day, this crisis does affect all of us now, and it's going to affect all of us into the future. It's just a matter of when it affects the region you're located in. So we need to really have a shift in mindset and perspective, I think, to this is an issue that's affecting all of us and will have worldwide ramifications. And therefore, we need to act now, and we can't delay and suggest that it's only affecting other places, because it might be affecting other places more now, but in the years to come, the crisis is going to be on our doorstep. So that's what I would say in relation to that sort of dynamic between different countries.
That was really insightful. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for the question. It was a great one. Oh, excellent. We have a question in the chat as well. So from Tristan, how can governments best adapt social protection systems that are inclusive of climate migrants and refugees? Often migrants and refugees are marginalized in these systems. That is an incredibly important question, Tristan. And I think really that is, again, something that we took away from our discussions with young people, is that in these social protection systems that migrants have to, like, into the new regions they find themselves in, they're often experiencing either marginalization or just being left out entirely of the social protection system. And so I think one of the ways that we see as a potential path forward to better ensure climate migrants are protected is really making sure that we integrate the climate migration experience into domestic policy and into domestic legislation and support systems. So we know that in a lot of regions that climate migrants are not actually recognized with, refugee status or otherwise. And so that obviously presents an initial barrier. But beyond that, when you don't have that formal recognition as a forcibly displaced person, you're then excluded from these social protection systems. So really the first stage, I think, is that we need to ensure that there's legal protection in order to be able to then provide these social protection systems. The second aspect, I would say, beyond sort of solving the root cause, would really be around, with these social protection systems, integrating customized support to the needs of climate migrants and climate refugees. Because the experience of having to be forcibly displaced, and in some situations, that homeland not existing anymore, whether that be due to rising sea levels or whether that be due to destruction of some other form, the trauma that comes with not being able at all to return to the homeland, we need to be able to have mental health support and physical health support and social support more broadly that is able to be tailored to that experience. And particularly having specialists trained in that area is going to be incredibly important. And I think for countries that are serious about change on this issue, those countries should be actioning that now, because we know that climate migration is only increasing and it's only becoming more urgent and becoming more prevalent into the future. And until we have, if we act now and start integrating those support systems, those regions are going to be best placed to provide really adequate support. So I think that's what I would really say around how can we could best move forward in terms of social protection systems. Excellent question. Thank you.
Okay, so one last question from my side. Amazing discussion. The question is, for the external migration and stuff, we, like government, need to compromise some of their citizenship laws in the first place, right? Like they need to ensure that if, for example, I'm from India, and according to the Indian citizenship law, if a person moves without a proper citizenship document, then he is considered an illegal immigrant. And that is illegal and punishable under Indian law. So we need to tweak these provisions to accommodate climate migrants. And I don't think most nations would be ready for that in the first place, because that again, like most nations, like there is possibilities of misusing these laws if it's tweaked to accommodate, climate refugees. Also, secondly, the representation of marginalized communities in climate policies would also, in a way, lead to allocating finances and budgets for infrastructures and any other supportive measures to ensure that their rights are protected. And most nations, let's say underdeveloped nations, like they don't have enough finances to ensure equality to people who are not marginalized in the first place. So how do you see this happening? Like the challenge of finances and the challenge of some of the significant loss of nations being, solved.
Absolutely, those are two fantastic questions. I think they're really incredibly important issues to actually be addressing right now. So it's really salient that you bring them up at this point. I would say in relation to financing, it's certainly not my area of expertise, to be completely honest, but I think that it's something we certainly have sort of an emerging area of study in terms of like climate finance. And so I think that one of the really interesting ways we can explore being able to better allocate financial resources, particularly with regions or countries that might not have adequate resources necessarily to support climate migrants or climate refugees, is potentially exploring and investing more into the climate finance space, and specifically within the climate finance space, how we can finance aid and support opportunities for people who have been displaced due to climate-related issues. So I think that would be a really interesting area to explore. And it's certainly something I would actually like to learn more about too. But I think that really investing in sort of the future change makers in that space and the big thinkers who have these ideas, particularly young people, about how we can take really innovative solutions with climate and finance would be one of the key ways to kind of better understand how we can move forward there. In relation to your question on citizenship laws, it's absolutely true. We know so often that people who are experiencing climate migration are often leaving without, in certain circumstances, proper documentation because of the urgency of the crisis or for other reasons as well. And so I think really the way we need to move forward on this issue is ensuring that we have adaptations to those laws and adaptations to those sorts of norms that we have in our countries to ensure that people are able to still seek protection and that we don't exclude people from protection because they had to urgently evacuate their home due to a climate crisis. And I think you're certainly right as well that so many countries and regions are not ready to have that discussion yet. But I think that really comes back to the importance of making sure that we are amplifying the voices of young people in these discussions, because young people are saying this is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed now. And if governments are going to take young people seriously, then we need to see those changes to citizenship and immigration law to ensure protection for climate refugees and migrants. Because as we talked about before, this is only a crisis that's going to increase into the future. And if we don't address it now and sort of make adaptations and changes to our laws now, we're going to be facing this issue in the future anyway. So it needs to be addressed at some point, and the best time is now, I would say.
Thank you, Aiden.
No problem. So we have a couple of minutes left, about 2 minutes, and we have one more question here from Ashley. So Ashley asks, should developing countries put climate change at the top of the list of national priorities and work towards uplifting certain disadvantaged communities despite rampant and more pressing social issues that affect the general population? Not to create a false dichotomy, countries can certainly work both at once, but should they prioritize one over the other? That is a very fascinating question. And I think that's certainly a dilemma that a lot of countries either face or will continue to face into the future in terms of being able to allocate national resources to social issues that they face within their own countries, but also their international obligations and their obligations to help compensate for either issues that they have created or to compensate in a way to assist their neighboring countries. In terms of whether one should be prioritized over the other, I can't necessarily comment on what needs to be prioritized because I think it varies a lot country to country. But what I would say is that all nations should be putting an increased focus and priority onto climate change as a really key national priority, as well as uplifting disadvantaged communities as a result of climate change, because it not only, we so often see it as something like we can work towards a better climate future and that's going to be good for the environment, but a better future in terms of our climate has benefits well beyond just the environment. It has benefits for the economy, it has benefits for international diplomacy, it has benefits for disadvantaged communities, for culture, for the livelihoods of people across the world. So I think by recognizing that we can actually help to solve in part some of the existing social issues we find ourselves facing in addressing the climate crisis is one realization I think it's really important for countries to come to. And in addition to that, being able to say that we need to start addressing this crisis right now because it's only going to worsen the existing social issues we find ourselves facing in our country if we don't take action now. And so I think being able to have a much broader perspective and being able to not only think of it in terms of environmental protection, but all the other benefits and also ramifications for inaction would really see a more productive approach and not necessarily having to prioritize certain things over others, but really a collective benefit for the country itself and for the international community as a whole. So that's what I would say in relation to prioritization and these different constraints that countries might be facing. Excellent question. All right. I think we're right on time now at 11 o'clock. So that is going to be the end for today of this side event. I'd really like to say an enormous thank you to everyone for coming today. It's been such a pleasure to be able to share my thoughts on this issue with you, as well as the findings we've had with our initial consultations that we're going to be continuing into the future. And thank you as well for your participation in this last part of the session. You had some incredible questions, and this is the sort of debate that we really need to have. And we need these perspectives to be amplified onto a broader scale and implemented into policy for a better future. And so, as Lauren's just put into the chat, if you want to make sure your voice is heard, please do come for the next session at 12:30, where we're going to be having a more formal consultation and documenting all these ideas down to ensure that they can go into MYCP's work. The last thing I would just say is do stay connected. If you found this session interesting, please do get in touch on LinkedIn and we can discuss this further if you'd like to, or also explore opportunities for collaboration with myself and the Migration Youth and Children platform. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope to see you at 12:30 and otherwise have a wonderful rest of your day.